Grace Nowell stood at the altar in her cream-colored dress, watching Thomas Henderson's face go pale as he stared not at her eyes but at her temples, where silver threads wove through her dark brown hair like frost on autumn leaves. She was 20 years old, and the gray had started appearing 6 months ago after her mother died of fever, after her father lost everything in a failed silver mine investment, after the weight of the world settled on her young shoulders and refused to leave. Thomas took a step backward, his hand dropping from hers as though she carried disease. "I cannot marry a woman who looks like my grandmother," he said, loud enough for the entire church in Gila City, Arizona Territory to hear. The year was 1881, and Grace felt every second of those 20 years pressing down on her as the congregation gasped and whispered. Thomas turned and walked down the aisle without another word, his boots echoing on the wooden floor like gunshots. Grace stood frozen, her bouquet of desert marigolds trembling in her hands, the minister beside her clearing his throat awkwardly. She did not cry, not there in front of everyone. She lifted her chin, gathered her skirts, and walked down that same aisle with her head high, even as the whispers grew louder. Her father waited at the back of the church, his face drawn and gray itself, though his hair remained dark. He was 52 and looked 70 after all the losses. "Grace, I am so sorry," he whispered as they stepped into the harsh Arizona sunlight. "Do not apologize for his cowardice," she said, her voice steady even as her heart cracked like dried earth. The streets of Gila City stretched before them, dusty and unforgiving. The town sat nestled in the Gila River Valley, surrounded by mountains that rose like sentinels against the blue sky. It was a mining town, rough and practical, where men outnumbered women 3 to 1, and grace was something found in short supply. They walked back to their small rented room above the general store, where Grace finally allowed herself to collapse into a chair. Her father paced, wringing his hands. He had borrowed money for the wedding, expecting Thomas to help them recover from their financial ruin. Thomas Henderson owned a successful freight business and had seemed like their salvation. Now they had nothing but debt and humiliation. "What will we do?" her father asked, more to himself than to her. Grace looked at her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. The gray streaks were more visible in the bright light coming through the window. They started at her temples and threaded back through her hair like rivers of silver. She had tried to hide them with careful pinning, but Thomas had seen them anyway. Everyone had seen them. "I will find work," she said. "I can sew, I can cook, I can keep books. Someone in this town needs help." Her father shook his head. "A young woman, unmarried, with gray hair. Grace, people will think you are cursed or sickly. Thomas has made sure everyone knows why he rejected you." "Then they are fools, just like him," Grace said, standing. She began unpinning her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. The gray caught the light, shimmering like the silver her father had once hoped to find in those cursed mines. "I will not hide in shame. I have done nothing wrong." But finding work proved harder than she expected. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace visited every establishment in Gila City. The hotel did not need help. The restaurant owner took one look at her and said she would scare away customers. The seamstress already had an assistant. Even the laundry, where Chinese workers toiled in steam and heat, turned her away. The story of her rejection had spread like wildfire, and with it came whispers that she was cursed, that her gray hair marked her as unlucky, that any business associated with her would fail. Her father's health began to decline from the stress. He coughed more, ate less, and spent his days staring out the window at the mountains. The debt collectors came twice, and Grace promised payment she did not have. She sold her mother's wedding ring, her own few pieces of jewelry, everything of value they owned. It bought them another month of rent and food, nothing more. Desperate, Grace decided to ride out to the surrounding ranches. She borrowed a tired mare from the livery stable owner, who took pity on her, and set out into the desert with a canteen of water and a list of names. The September heat was brutal, the sun beating down mercilessly as she rode along dusty trails. She passed saguaro cacti standing like silent witnesses and heard the cry of hawks overhead. The first 3 ranches turned her away at the gate. The 4th belonged to a widow who looked at Grace with sympathy, but said she could barely feed herself. The 5th was abandoned, windows broken and cattle gone. Grace was about to turn back as the sun began its descent when she spotted a wooden sign that read Thornton Ranch, pointing down a well-maintained road. The Thornton Ranch sprawled across a valley between 2 ridges, with a main house built of adobe and wood that looked solid and well kept. Corrals held horses and cattle, and she could see several outbuildings including a large barn. As Grace rode up, 3 men emerged from the barn, all stopping to watch her approach. She straightened in the saddle, refusing to show her exhaustion or desperation. The man in the center stepped forward, and Grace felt her breath catch despite herself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing work-worn denim and a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hat shaded his face, but as he came closer and removed it, she saw he was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-bronzed skin, dark brown hair, and eyes the color of the sky before a storm. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it smiled often, though he was not smiling now. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice deep and courteous. "I am looking for work," Grace said, dismounting before he could tell her to leave. She tied the mare to the fence post and turned to face him directly. "I can cook, clean, mend, keep books, and work harder than any man you employ. I need a job, and I will prove my worth if you give me a chance." The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving across her face. She waited for his eyes to catch on the gray in her hair, for his expression to change to disgust or pity. Instead, his eyes remained on hers, steady and thoughtful. "I am Jackson Thornton. This is my ranch," he said. "What is your name?" "Grace Nowell." Recognition flickered across his face. "You are the woman from the wedding." Grace lifted her chin. "Yes, Thomas Henderson is a coward and a fool. If you plan to judge me by his standards, I will save us both time and leave now." Jackson Thornton surprised her by smiling, a slow warmth that transformed his entire face. "Any man who would humiliate a woman at the altar is indeed both a coward and a fool. I asked because I wanted to know if you were the same Grace Nowell I heard about, the one who told the minister to donate all the wedding food to the orphanage instead of letting it go to waste." Grace blinked. She had done that, but she had not known anyone noticed. It seemed wasteful otherwise. "That tells me you are practical and kind," Jackson said. "2 qualities I value highly. As it happens, I do need help. My housekeeper left 3 weeks ago to live with her daughter in California, and I have been making do with burnt food and a dirty house ever since. Can you start tomorrow?" Relief flooded through Grace so powerfully she nearly swayed. "I can start today if you wish." Jackson shook his head. "Tomorrow is soon enough. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. You will have your own cabin, small but private, about 50 yards from the main house. I employ 6 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, and they will treat you with respect or answer to me. Is that acceptable?" $30 a month was generous, more than she had hoped for. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Jackson extended his hand, and she shook it, feeling the calluses on his palm and the strength in his grip. His hand was warm, and he held hers perhaps a moment longer than necessary before releasing it. "Go back to town, settle your affairs, and return tomorrow with your belongings. If you need help transporting anything, send word and I will send a wagon," Jackson said. Grace rode back to Gila City as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. When she told her father the news, he wept with relief. She spent that evening packing their few belongings and paid their debts with an advance Jackson had insisted on giving her. The landlord was surprised but took the money readily enough. Her father would move into her cabin with her until his health improved enough for him to find his own work. The next morning, one of Jackson's ranch hands arrived with a wagon. He was a young Mexican man named Carlos who tipped his hat politely and helped load their belongings. The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours, and Carlos pointed out landmarks along the way. "Mr. Thornton is a good man," Carlos said in accented English. "Fair and honest. We are lucky to work for him. He built this ranch from nothing after the war, worked harder than any 3 men. He deserves a good housekeeper." "I will do my best," Grace promised. The cabin Jackson had mentioned was indeed small, just 2 rooms with a fireplace, a stove, and simple furniture. But it was clean and sturdy, with glass windows and a solid door. After months in the cramped room above the general store, it felt like a palace. Her father settled into one of the chairs with a blanket, already looking better for being out of town. Grace went to the main house and knocked on the door. Jackson answered, and she noticed he had cleaned up, wearing a fresh shirt and with his hair still damp from washing. The house smelled like burned bacon and coffee. "Welcome to chaos," he said with a self-deprecating smile, gesturing inside. "I am afraid I have let things go somewhat." The house was not as bad as he suggested, just dusty and cluttered with the disorganization of a man living alone. The kitchen needed attention and the floors wanted scrubbing, but Grace had seen worse. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, and Jackson had the good sense to leave her to it, heading back outside to work with his men. By evening, the kitchen gleamed, the floors were clean, and Grace had prepared a proper dinner of roasted chicken, beans, fresh bread, and dried apple pie. She rang the bell on the porch at 6 o'clock as Jackson had instructed, and the men came in from the fields and corrals, washing up at the pump outside. They filed into the dining room Jackson had told her to use, sitting at a long wooden table scarred with use. Jackson sat at the head of the table, and when Grace brought out the food, she watched his eyes widen. The ranch hands exclaimed with delight, and for the next 20 minutes, the only sounds were eating and appreciative murmurs. Grace served her father in their cabin, then returned to find the men had cleaned their plates. "Miss Nowell, if you cook like this every day, you will spoil us beyond redemption," Jackson said, leaning back in his chair with satisfaction. "That was the best meal I have had in months." "I told you I could cook," Grace said, allowing herself a small smile. "Tomorrow I will tackle the rest of the house if that is acceptable. More than acceptable, thank you." The days fell into a rhythm. Grace rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the men, then spent her days cleaning, mending, and organizing the house. She baked bread, churned butter, tended the vegetable garden behind the house that had been neglected, and prepared hearty meals that the ranch hands praised effusively. Her father's health slowly improved with good food and clean air, and he began helping with small tasks around the property. Jackson treated Grace with unfailing courtesy and respect. He never mentioned her gray hair, never looked at her with pity or disgust. Instead, he often sought her opinion on household matters, asked about her father's health, and engaged her in conversation about everything from the weather to politics. Grace found herself looking forward to these conversations, to the way Jackson listened intently when she spoke. His storm-gray eyes focused entirely on her. 3 weeks after Grace started working at the ranch, Jackson came into the kitchen one afternoon carrying a ledger. "Miss Nowell, Carlos mentioned you said you can keep books. Is that true?" "Yes, my father taught me mathematics and bookkeeping. Why do you ask?" Jackson set the ledger on the table with a grimace. "Because I hate it and I am terrible at it. I can breed cattle and break horses and build fences all day, but numbers on a page make me want to throw things. Would you be willing to take over the accounts? I will pay you extra." Grace opened the ledger and immediately saw the problem. Jackson's handwriting was barely legible, numbers were crossed out and rewritten, and there was no clear system. "This is a disaster," she said honestly. Jackson laughed, a rich sound that made something warm bloom in Grace's chest. "I know. Will you fix it?" "It will take time, but yes, I can fix it." She spent the next several evenings in Jackson's office, a room lined with books and smelling of leather and tobacco smoke. Jackson often worked at his desk while she organized the accounts, and they fell into a comfortable silence broken by occasional questions or comments. Grace learned that Jackson had fought in the Civil War, that he had come west with nothing but a horse and a dream, that he had built the ranch through sheer determination and hard work. He learned that Grace's mother had died of typhoid, that her father had been a mining engineer before bad investments ruined him, that Grace had read every book in the Gila City Library twice. One evening in October, as Grace worked on the accounts by lamplight, Jackson set down his pen and looked at her. "May I ask you a personal question?" Grace glanced up, wary. "You may ask. I may not answer." "Your hair," he said, and Grace's stomach tightened. Why did it turn gray so young? She considered lying or deflecting, but something about the genuine curiosity in Jackson's eyes, the complete absence of judgment, made her tell the truth. "The doctor said it was from stress and grief. After my mother died, after we lost everything, it just started happening. I tried dyeing it once, but it did not take well and looked worse, so I stopped trying to hide it." Jackson nodded slowly. "My mother's hair went white after my father died. She was 35. People said it made her look distinguished." He paused, then added quietly, "I think your gray streaks are beautiful. They catch the light like silver." Grace's heart stuttered. No one had ever called them beautiful. Thomas had called them hideous. The townspeople called them a curse. But Jackson looked at her with complete sincerity, no mockery in his expression. "Silver linings," she murmured. "What?" "My father used to say that about silver ore, that every dark rock might have silver linings running through it, treasure hidden in unexpected places." Grace touched her hair self-consciously. "I suppose that is one way to think of them." "It is the right way to think of them," Jackson said firmly. He held her gaze for a long moment before returning to his work, but Grace found it hard to concentrate after that. The weather grew cooler as October progressed. Grace made new curtains for the house, reorganized the pantry, and put up preserves from the garden's last harvest. Her father began keeping the books for the ranch's supply orders, giving him purpose and pride. The ranch hands treated Grace with respect bordering on reverence, especially after she nursed Carlos through a bad fever and made special meals when any of them were sick or injured. Jackson continued to surprise her. He brought her books from Tucson when he went for supplies, remembering she had mentioned loving to read. He fixed the shutter on her cabin without being asked. He always thanked her for meals, even simple ones, and never demanded anything of her beyond her job duties. Grace found herself watching for him, listening for his voice, feeling a flutter in her chest when he smiled at her. But she was also afraid. Thomas had seemed kind at first too, before he showed his true colors. Grace had learned that men could be cruel, that affection could evaporate in an instant. She kept her growing feelings locked away, afraid to hope for something that might not be real. In early November, a cold snap brought frost to the desert mornings. Grace was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard shouting from outside. She ran to the window and saw several men on horseback approaching fast, their animals lathered and wild-eyed. Jackson and his ranch hands met them at the corral, and Grace could see the tension in everyone's posture. She stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. One of the approaching men shouted something about cattle rustlers, about a ranch being attacked. Jackson turned and called orders to his men, who immediately began saddling fresh horses. Grace's stomach clenched with fear as Jackson strapped on a gun belt she had never seen him wear. He caught sight of her on the porch and jogged over. "There is trouble at the Morrison Ranch. Rustlers attacked during the night. Several ranchers are riding together to track them down and help the Morrisons." "Be careful," Grace said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Jackson's expression softened. "I will. Stay in the house with your father until we return. Carlos is staying here to watch the property." He reached out as if to touch her hand, then seemed to think better of it and tipped his hat instead. "I will be back soon, Miss Nowell." Grace watched him ride away with 5 of his men, her heart in her throat. She tried to work to keep busy, but every sound made her jump. Carlos patrolled the property with a rifle, and Grace brought him coffee and food throughout the day. Her father sat by the window, watching the road. The men returned just after sunset, tired and dusty but unharmed. Grace rushed out to meet them, propriety forgotten in her relief. Jackson dismounted and smiled at her, and Grace realized with startling clarity that she had fallen in love with him. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, overwhelming and terrifying. She loved his kindness, his integrity, the way he treated everyone with respect, the way he had never once made her feel less than worthy because of her appearance. "We caught up with the rustlers," Jackson said, leading his horse to the barn. Grace walked beside him, desperate to be near him even as her heart pounded with this new understanding. "Recovered most of the stolen cattle. The Morrison Ranch will be all right." "I am glad you are safe," Grace said quietly. Jackson looked at her and something flickered in his eyes, something warm and intense that made Grace's breath catch. "Were you worried about me, Miss Nowell?" "Of course I was worried. If you died, who would manage this disaster of a ranch?" she said, trying for lightness even as her voice shook slightly. Jackson laughed, but his eyes remained serious. He handed his horse off to one of the other men and turned to face Grace fully. "May I speak with you after dinner? Privately?" Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. The meal that evening was subdued, the men tired from their hard ride. After everyone finished eating and the dishes were cleaned, Jackson knocked on her cabin door. Her father had tactfully retreated to the bedroom, leaving Grace alone in the main room. "Come in," she called, smoothing her skirt nervously. Jackson entered, hat in hands, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. He stood just inside the door, turning his hat in his hands. "Miss Nowell, Grace, I need to tell you something, and I apologize if I am overstepping bounds." Grace's heart hammered. "Go ahead." "When you came to my ranch 2 months ago, I hired you because I needed help, yes, but also because I was furious at Thomas Henderson for humiliating you. I had seen you in town before, had noticed you, thought you were beautiful. I could not understand how any man could be so foolish." Grace opened her mouth to speak, but Jackson held up a hand. "Please, let me finish before I lose my courage. These past weeks, getting to know you, watching you bring life back to this house, talking with you, laughing with you, I have come to realize that I did not just think you were beautiful. I think you are extraordinary. You are smart, capable, kind, resilient. You handle everything life throws at you with grace that matches your name. And today, when I rode out not knowing what we would face, my only thought was that I wanted to come back to you. Tears pricked Grace's eyes. Jackson, I know I am just a rancher, rough around the edges, not educated or refined like you deserve. I know you have been hurt badly and probably need time, but I had to tell you how I feel. I am in love with you, Grace. I have been falling in love with you since the first day you stood in my yard and told me you would work harder than any man. A tear slipped down Grace's cheek, but she was smiling. You think I am the extraordinary one. Jackson, you took a chance on me when no one else would. You treated me with respect and kindness from the very first moment. You never once made me feel ashamed of my appearance. You brought me books and fixed my shutters and listened when I talked. You are the finest man I have ever known, and I. She took a shaky breath. I love you too. I realized it today when you rode away, when I thought I might never get to tell you. Jackson crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hands in his eyes searching her face. You mean that? You truly love me? With all my heart, Grace whispered. Jackson raised her hands to his lips and kissed them gently, reverently. I do not want to rush you. I do not want you to feel any pressure. But Grace, I want you to know that I intend to marry you someday if you will have me. When you are ready, when you are certain, I will be here. Grace laughed through her tears. Jackson Thornton, are you proposing? Not officially, not yet. I want to do it right, want to court you properly first. But yes, I am saying that I want to spend my life with you if you will let me. Grace looked up at this good, honest man who had seen past her gray hair to the person beneath, who had called those gray streaks silver linings, who had given her hope when she thought she had none left. Yes, she said simply. My answer is yes. I do not need courting or time. I know my own heart, and I know yours. I want to marry you, Jackson. Jackson's face lit up like the sun breaking over the mountains. He cupped her face in his calloused hands and leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. Grace rose on her toes to meet him, and their lips touched in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. I will still court you properly, Jackson murmured against her forehead. You deserve romance and attention and all the things you should have had from Thomas Henderson. I do not want what Thomas would have given me, Grace said firmly. I want what you are offering. Honesty, respect, partnership, love. That is worth more than all the romance in the world. They told her father that evening, and the old man wept with joy. He shook Jackson's hand and thanked him for seeing his daughter's true worth. They told the ranch hands the next morning, and the men cheered and congratulated them. Carlos immediately began planning a celebration. True to his word, Jackson courted Grace properly despite her protests that it was unnecessary. He took her on rides through the desert, showing her the beauty of the land he loved. They had picnics by a creek that ran through his property, sitting on blankets and talking for hours. He brought her wildflowers, made her laugh, shared his dreams of expanding the ranch and building a legacy. Grace showed him how to organize his accounts more efficiently, taught him to enjoy reading, shared her own hopes for the future. In December, Jackson took Grace to Tucson for 3 days, a trip that served as both business and pleasure. They stayed in separate rooms at a respectable hotel, but spent their days exploring the town together. Jackson bought her a beautiful dress in deep blue that brought out her eyes, and insisted on purchasing new gloves, a warm coat, and a hat decorated with silk flowers. Grace protested the expense, but Jackson simply smiled and told her she deserved beautiful things. On the last evening in Tucson, Jackson took her to dinner at the finest restaurant in town. After they finished eating, he reached across the table and took her hand. "Grace Nowell, I have loved you since the moment you told me Thomas Henderson was a coward and a fool. I have loved your strength, your intelligence, your kindness, your beauty. You have made my house a home and my life complete. Will you marry me and be my wife?" He pulled out a ring, a simple gold band set with 3 small stones that caught the lamplight, 2 garnets flanking a central piece of turquoise the color of the Arizona sky. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her up from her chair, kissing her right there in the restaurant to the applause of the other diners. Grace did not care who saw. She kissed him back, pouring all her love and happiness into that kiss. They married the following week in the same church where Thomas Henderson had rejected Grace just 3 months earlier. The minister seemed both surprised and pleased by this turn of events. The church was full, not with curious gossips this time but with genuine well-wishers. All of Jackson's ranch hands attended, along with neighboring ranchers and their families, the shopkeepers from town who had come to know and respect Grace, even some of the women who had whispered about her before. Grace wore the blue dress Jackson had bought her in Tucson, with her hair arranged simply, the gray streaks visible and beautiful. Jackson stood waiting for her at the altar in a new black suit, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle. This time there was no hesitation, no cruelty, only love. "I do not see gray hair," Jackson had told her that morning when she worried aloud about her appearance. "I see silver linings, I see treasure. I see the woman I love, more beautiful than anything I could have imagined." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed her tenderly, and Grace knew she had finally found where she belonged. They held a reception at the ranch, with food and music and dancing that lasted into the night. Grace danced with her husband, her father, the ranch hands, and felt happiness so profound it almost frightened her. That night, in the bedroom Jackson had carefully prepared for them, decorated with flowers and candles, they consummated their marriage with tenderness and passion. Jackson was gentle, patient, showing Grace pleasure she had never imagined. He kissed the gray streaks in her hair, called her beautiful, worshipped her body with his hands and mouth until she forgot to be self-conscious. They made love 3 times that night, learning each other's bodies, whispering words of love in the darkness. The following months were the happiest of Grace's life. She managed the household and helped with the ranch accounts while Jackson worked the land. They made decisions together, supported each other, laughed together. Her father regained his health and began helping manage the ranch's supply chain, giving him purpose and dignity. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, with Jackson's skill and Grace's organizational abilities creating a smoothly running operation. Spring came to the desert in a riot of wildflowers, painting the landscape in vivid colors. Grace discovered she was pregnant in April, and Jackson's joy was so complete he swept her up and spun her around despite her protests. He became even more protective, insisting she not overwork herself, bringing her anything she needed. Grace found his attention both endearing and occasionally frustrating, but she loved him for his care. Their son was born in December of 1882, a healthy baby boy they named James after Jackson's father. Jackson wept when he held his son for the first time, and Grace watched with a heart so full she thought it might burst. Jackson was a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with James during colicky nights, singing lullabies in his deep voice. 2 years later, Grace gave birth to twin daughters, Emma and Sarah, who had their mother's dark eyes and their father's easy smiles. the house filled with laughter and noise and love. Grace's father doted on his grandchildren, and the ranch hands competed to be the children's favorites, carving them toys and teaching them to ride almost before they could walk. Grace's gray streaks became more pronounced over the years, spreading until by the time she was 30, her hair was more silver than brown. She wore it proudly now, never trying to hide it. People in Gila City came to see her gray hair as distinctive and beautiful rather than cursed, especially after they saw how successful and happy the Thornton Ranch had become. Thomas Henderson eventually married a woman from California, a union that by all accounts was loveless and miserable. Grace felt no satisfaction in his unhappiness, only gratitude that she had escaped that fate. She occasionally saw him in town and nodded politely, but felt nothing. That rejection, which had seemed like the end of her world, had actually been her salvation. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jackson gave Grace a pair of silver hair combs decorated with turquoise. "For the silver in your hair," he said, kissing her temple. "Still the most beautiful sight I see every day." They were sitting on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. Grace's father sat in his rocking chair nearby, aged but healthy, reading to little James. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and thriving. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked, leaning against Jackson's shoulder. Taking a chance on a rejected bride with gray hair, Jackson wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "Not for a single second. You were never the rejected bride, Grace. You were the woman who was waiting for the right man to recognize your worth. I am just grateful I was smart enough to see it." Grace tilted her face up and kissed him, tasting the coffee he had drunk and the love that had never wavered. "Silver linings," she murmured against his lips. "Silver linings," Jackson agreed, kissing her again. "The very best kind." 3 more children joined their family over the following years, 2 more sons and another daughter. The Thornton Ranch grew to become one of the most successful in the territory, known for quality cattle and horses, but also for fair treatment of workers and honest business practices. Jackson and Grace's partnership became legendary in the area, an example of what 2 people could accomplish when they worked together with love and respect. Grace's hair turned completely white by the time she was 40, and Jackson claimed she grew more beautiful every year. He never stopped courting her, never stopped bringing her flowers or stealing kisses in the barn or telling her he loved her. Their children grew up watching their parents' affection, learning that marriage should be a partnership of equals, that love was something you chose and nurtured every day. When Grace was 45 and Jackson 55, they sat on that same porch watching their oldest son James ride out with his new wife to start his own ranch on land Jackson had given him. Emma and Sarah were married to good men, fine ranchers who treated them with respect. The younger children were growing fast, already showing signs of the strong, capable adults they would become. "We built something good," Grace said, watching the dust settle behind James's wagon. "We built something extraordinary," Jackson corrected, taking her hand. Her hair was pure white now, catching the sunlight like spun silver. His own hair had gone gray at the temples, and lines creased his face, but his eyes held the same warmth they had the first day she met him. Grace's father had passed peacefully in his sleep 2 years earlier, content and surrounded by family. They had buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, where he could watch over the land and the family he loved. Grace still missed him, but she knew he had died happy, having seen his daughter thrive beyond his wildest dreams. The ranch continued to prosper. Jackson taught their sons everything he knew about raising cattle and managing land, while Grace taught their daughters to be strong, independent women who knew their worth. but she also taught her sons to cook and keep books, and Jackson taught their daughters to ride and rope, because both believed their children should be capable in all things. As the years passed and Grace moved into her 50s, her white hair became her signature. Women in Gila City began leaving their own gray hair undyed, inspired by Grace's confidence. The story of how Jackson had called her gray-streaked silver linings became part of local folklore, told and retold as an example of true love and seeing beyond surface appearances. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole town of Gila City threw them a celebration. The church was decorated with flowers and ribbons, and nearly everyone in town attended. The mayor gave a speech about how the Thorntons represented the best of the territory, how their success and obvious love had inspired the community. Grace and Jackson danced to music played by a band brought in from Tucson, and Grace wore another blue dress, this one elegant and expensive, her white hair arranged in an intricate style that showed it off proudly. Jackson pulled her close as they danced, whispering in her ear, "I fell in love with a woman with dark hair and gray streaks who told me Thomas Henderson was a fool. I am now married to a silver-haired goddess who runs a ranch better than most men and gave me 6 beautiful children. How did I get so lucky? I fell in love with a rancher who saw treasure where others saw a curse," Grace whispered back. "Who gave me a home and a family and showed me what real love looks like. I think we are both lucky." They kissed right there on the dance floor, to the applause and cheers of the entire town. No longer young but still deeply in love, still partners in every sense of the word. The territorial governor attended their 30th anniversary celebration, praising their contributions to Arizona's development. By then, 3 of their children had their own successful ranches. One daughter was a teacher in Tucson, and their youngest son was studying law in San Francisco. The Thornton name was respected throughout the territory. Jackson and Grace grew old together, their love never fading. On warm evenings, they still sat on their porch holding hands, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. Grace's hair remained white as snow, and Jackson still told her she was beautiful every single day. They had weathered droughts and floods, cattle diseases and financial challenges, the trials of raising children and building a legacy. Through it all, their partnership remained strong. When Grace was 62, Jackson surprised her with a trip back to Tucson, to the same hotel where they had stayed during their courtship. They walked the streets hand in hand, both moving slower now but still together. He took her to the same restaurant where he had proposed, and they ate dinner remembering that night 30 years earlier. "I would do it all again," Jackson said, raising his glass to her. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, I would choose you every single time. Even knowing I would turn completely white by 40, Grace teased, touching her hair. "Especially knowing that," Jackson said firmly. "You wear your years like a crown, Grace. Every silver strand is a testament to your strength, your resilience, your beauty. I am proud to be your husband." They made love that night in their hotel room, slower and gentler than in their youth, but no less passionate, no less meaningful. They knew each other's bodies intimately after 3 decades of marriage, knew exactly how to bring each other pleasure. Jackson traced the lines on Grace's face with tender fingers, kissed the white hair he had always loved, and showed her with actions what his words had already proven. The Arizona Territory became a state in their lifetime, and they celebrated along with their neighbors. They became grandparents many times over, and eventually great-grandparents, their legacy spreading across the state. The Thornton Ranch passed to their sons, who ran it with the same integrity and skill their father had taught them. Grace published a small book when she was 65, a memoir of life in territorial Arizona that became quite popular. She wrote about building a life from nothing, about the importance of partnership in marriage, about finding beauty in unexpected places. She dedicated it to Jackson, who taught me to see silver linings. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, dozens of people who owed their existence to the love between a rejected bride and a rancher who saw her worth. The family gathered at the ranch that had been home for so many years, now expanded and modernized but still recognizable as the place where their story began. Jackson stood up at dinner that night and raised his glass. His hair was white now, too, his face deeply lined, but his voice was still strong. 40 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I had ever met. A woman who came to me looking for work, who told me she could work harder than any man. She was right. She worked harder, loved stronger, built better than anyone I have ever known. Grace, you are my silver lining, my treasure, my greatest blessing. Here is to 40 more years. Everyone cheered and drank, though they all knew 40 more years was unlikely at their age. But Grace raised her own glass and said, "However many years we have left, I am grateful for everyone." Jackson Thornton saw me when others looked away. He loved me when another man rejected me. He built a life with me, not for me. That is the greatest gift anyone could give. They lived 7 more years together, growing frailer but never losing their love or their partnership. Jackson's health began to fail when he was 77, his heart wearing out after a lifetime of hard work. On a spring morning much like the one when Grace first came to his ranch, Jackson died peacefully in their bed with Grace holding his hand, surrounded by their children. Grace mourned him deeply, but without regret. They had built a beautiful life together, had loved each other completely, had created a legacy that would continue for generations. She wore black for a year, as was proper, and then she began wearing colors again because Jackson had always loved seeing her in blue. She lived another 8 years, remaining sharp and active, beloved by her family and respected by her community. She spent her days writing, gardening, and spoiling her great-grandchildren. She never remarried, never even considered it. Jackson had been her partner, her love, her silver lining, and no one could replace him. Grace Nowell Thornton died at the age of 77 on a December morning, with snow falling softly outside her window, a rare sight in Arizona. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her bed, and her last words were, "Tell Jackson I am coming. Tell him I love him still." They buried her next to Jackson on the hill overlooking the ranch, her tombstone reading Grace Nowell Thornton, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She wore her silver with pride. The Thornton Ranch continued for generations, each successive owner knowing the story of their ancestors. The tale of the rejected bride with gray streaks and the rancher who called them silver linings became part of family lore, told to every child as an example of true love and recognizing worth beyond appearances. In Gila City, a historical marker was eventually placed on the site of the old church, commemorating the spot where Thomas Henderson made his biggest mistake and Jackson Thornton found his greatest love. The story was included in books about Arizona history, a footnote about how sometimes the most painful rejections lead to the most beautiful outcomes. And somewhere on a hill in Arizona, 2 stones stand side by side, marking where Grace and Jackson rest together, their love story complete. The silver streaks that once marked Grace as cursed became symbols of strength, resilience, and the beauty of being truly seen and loved for exactly who you are. Their descendants still live in Arizona, still run ranches, still tell the story of how finding silver linings in the darkness can lead to treasure beyond measure. The rejected bride had indeed found her silver lining, and that lining was woven through every day of a long, happy life filled with love, partnership, and purpose. Jackson had seen past surface appearances to the extraordinary woman beneath, and in doing so, had given both of them a love story for the ages. It was a story that proved true beauty comes from within, that the right person will see your worth when others cannot, and that sometimes what seems like an ending is really just the beginning of something far better than you ever imagined possible. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit those graves on the hill, bringing flowers in spring and standing in respectful silence. They look at the dates carved in stone, do the math, and realize their ancestors had 47 years together, 47 years of love and partnership and building something lasting. They touch the stones and remember the story, then go back down the hill to their own lives, carrying forward the lessons Grace and Jackson taught through their example. Love is not about perfection or surface beauty. Love is about seeing someone fully, accepting them completely, and choosing them every day. It is about partnership and respect, laughter and support, weathering storms together and celebrating victories as one. It is about calling someone's perceived flaws their finest features, about finding treasure where others see only ordinary stone, about recognizing that silver linings are the most precious kind of all. Grace and Jackson understood that, lived it, and proved it every day of their lives together. And their story, born from rejection and transformed by true love, echoes still through the desert air of Arizona, a reminder that happy endings are not just for fairy tales. Sometimes they happen to real people who dare to see beyond the surface and love with their whole hearts.